Every morning for 3 years, he walked past her. Same corridor, same marble floors, same 7:30. Same man who never once slowed his step. She was always there, standing just beyond the second arch, a cup of tea in her hands, her eyes following him with something she had long since learned not to show. She never called out, never moved closer. She simply watched him pass, the way you watch a season change when you already know you cannot hold it. He never looked. Not at her. Not at the flowers she placed on that table every single morning without exception. Not at the woman who had quietly, patiently, and without any demand for recognition, made his house into something worth living in. 3 years. 642 mornings. And then, one morning, she wasn't there. The flowers were gone. The blue vase was empty, and the man who had never once paused to look at what he had suddenly couldn't stop. This is the story of what a person discovers when they finally stand still, and what it costs when standing still comes 3 years too late. Dorian Ashbourne did not consider himself a man who missed things. He was thorough by nature, precise by discipline, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes from having managed a great estate, a considerable fortune, and an impeccable public reputation without a single significant error. He noticed what required noticing. He attended to what demanded attention. And every morning at 7:30, he walked the length of the East Corridor with the absolute certainty of a man who has accounted for everything in his world, and found it, without exception, entirely in order. What he never noticed, not once in 3 years of marriage, was the woman standing just beyond that second arch. She was always there, a cup of tea warming her hands, her dress the quiet color of early morning, her eyes following him with an expression she had long since learned to keep very still. She did not call out to him. She did not step forward. She simply watched, the way one watches a season change, with the slow understanding that some things are beautiful precisely because they move without looking back. That morning, like every morning before it, Dorian Ashbourne walked past her without slowing his step. The corridor echoed. The roses outside the window had opened overnight, pale gold her favorite, and not one person in that grand house knew it but her. But that particular morning was different from all the others, though no one inside those walls had any reason yet to feel it. The difference was not in the light, nor in the air, nor in the familiar sound of his boots on cold marble. The difference was in her, and it had been building for a very long time. Her name was Maren, and she had been the Duchess of Ashbourne for 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. She knew the number not because she had been counting down to something, but because certain anniversaries have a way of announcing themselves quietly in the chest. A dull ache that arrives each year without invitation and leaves without ceremony. The house was magnificent. The house was also, in every way that mattered, not her home. She had learned the rhythms of Ashbourne Hall the way one learns a foreign language, with effort, with patience, and with the growing awareness that fluency would never quite come. She knew which floors creaked after midnight, which fireplaces drew smoke when the north wind came, which roses in the garden bloomed first, and which ones the head gardener quietly avoided because the previous duchess had planted them. She knew everything about this house, except the one thing she had arrived hoping to find, a place within it that was truly and unmistakably hers. The staff respected her. The tradespeople addressed her by title. Guests praised her table and her composure. But at the end of every evening, when the candles were extinguished and the great house settled into its familiar silences, Maren sat by the window of her chamber, and understood something that no amount of silk or silver could obscure. That a woman could stand at the very center of a life and still be its most invisible detail. They had married on a Tuesday in October, which Maren had always thought was a strange choice for a wedding. Not that she had been consulted. The union had been arranged between their families with the brisk efficiency of a business transaction, complete with signed documents, a brief ceremony, and a reception at which her new husband had spoken pleasantly to every guest in the room except her. She had stood beside him in ivory silk and told herself it was nerves. She had gone on telling herself that for much longer than she cared to admit. Dorian Ashbourne was not a cruel man. That was the part that made everything so much harder to name, even to herself. He did not raise his voice. He did not dismiss her in public or treat her with the casual indifference that some men of his rank deployed like a second language. He was polite. He was composed. He was, in every formal sense, a perfectly adequate husband. And that adequacy was its own particular kind of solitude. The kind that leaves no visible mark and therefore invites no sympathy from anyone watching from the outside. He simply did not see her. Not in a way that required intention, but in the quiet, slow way that some people fail to notice what has always been directly in front of them. She was a feature of Ashbourne Hall, as present and as unremarkable as the portraits in the gallery, the vases on the mantel, the roses that bloomed faithfully each spring, whether or not a single soul paused to appreciate them. Maren had not entered this marriage without hope. That was the truth she rarely allowed herself to revisit, because it required admitting how much she had once believed, in him, in the possibility of warmth beneath his restraint, in the quiet conviction that time and closeness could build something real between two people that circumstance had not yet arranged. She had watched him from a careful distance before the agreements were ever signed, and what she had seen was not coldness, it was absence. The particular stillness of a man who had learned to keep himself very far from the surface of his own life. She had thought, with the gentle certainty of someone who has not yet been truly disappointed, that she could reach him. Not through performance or strategy, but simply by being present, by being honest, by offering the kind of patient attention that asks for nothing in return and hopes, in time, to be answered in kind. She had placed fresh flowers on the table in the East Corridor every single morning for 8 months before she accepted that he had never once glanced at them. She had continued placing them for 2 more years after that, because by then it had become less about him and more about refusing to stop being herself. That was the thing about Dorian Ashbourne that no one in society seemed to grasp, because no one in society had been watching with the same quiet precision that she had. Beneath the title, beneath the discipline, beneath the flawless performance of his public manner, there was a man who had decided, at some point long before she arrived, that certain rooms inside himself were better left permanently locked. She had spent 3 years standing outside those doors with more patience than she had ever asked for credit for. And lately, in the hours before sleep, she had begun asking herself a question she could no longer push away. Whether staying outside a locked door was a form of loyalty, or simply a habit she had mistaken for one. She had placed those flowers every single morning for 3 years. He had walked past them every single morning for 3 years, and here is what no one in that house yet understood, including Maren herself, in that quiet hour before the decision came. The flowers were never really for him. They were the last proof she kept, every morning, that she was still there, still herself, still worth the effort of beauty in an empty corridor. But there is something else, something that Dorian Ashbourne carried inside him that even he could not name, a reason for the locked doors that went back much further than their marriage, much further than anything Maren had ever been told. And when that reason finally comes to light, it will not excuse what he failed to give her, but it will change the way you understand everything that came before. Stay with us. It had started as instinct, the kind of small private gesture that reveals far more about a person's character than any grand declaration ever could. The first morning after they returned from their wedding journey, Maren had risen before the house was fully awake, walked to the garden while the dew was still heavy on the grass, and cut a small arrangement of whatever was in bloom. Pale roses in October, winter jasmine in January, sweet peas in the long warmth of July. She placed them on the narrow table in the east corridor, just beside the second arch, in a simple blue vase she had found at the back of a storage room and quietly claimed as her own. She did it because the corridor was cold, and the house felt like a sentence she had not yet finished reading, and the flowers made the space feel briefly, genuinely inhabited. She did it because arranging something living in an empty space was the closest she could come, that first year, to saying, without words, without drama, without asking permission, "I am here." She did it because she was, at her foundation, a woman who responded to being overlooked not with retreat, but with a quiet, almost stubborn insistence on beauty, as though loveliness placed in an unseen corner might, eventually, make the overlooking impossible. 3 years later, the blue vase was still on that table. The flowers were still changed every morning without fail, and every morning at 7:30, Dorian Ashbourne walked past them without once breaking his stride. What no one in that house could have known, not the staff, not the society correspondents who praised the Duke's immaculate estate in their weekly columns, was that on the morning everything finally shifted. Maren had placed the most carefully arranged flowers she had ever made, late roses in the last warmth of autumn, bound with a single dried sprig of lavender from her mother's garden back home. She had taken unusual care with them, as though, somewhere beneath the habit and the hope, some quiet part of her already understood that they would be the last. Their evenings together followed the same unvarying pattern, arranged with the precision of a schedule no one had written down, but both had somehow memorized. Dinner at 8, seated at opposite ends of a table built for formal occasions, and therefore never quite suited for two. He would speak, when he spoke at all, of the estate, of Parliament, of correspondence that required his attention in the morning. She would listen, offer a quiet observation, and watch the distance between them remain exactly as wide as it had been the evening before. It was not that he was unkind in those moments. Kindness, in its way, would have been easier to carry. Kindness at least acknowledges that another person is present. What Dorian offered across that long table was something closer to courtesy, the practiced politeness of a man fulfilling a social form with appropriate competence. He never interrupted her. He never dismissed what she said. He simply received her words, the way one receives a report from a distant county, noting the information briefly, without particular investment, and then returning his attention to other concerns. Maren had read once, in a book she had carried from her girlhood home and kept faithfully on her nightstand through 3 years of marriage, that silence between two people is never truly empty. She had believed it once. She believed it still, in fact, only now she understood it differently. The silence between her and Dorian was not empty. It was full. It was full of every conversation he had considered and set aside, every question he had not asked, every morning he had walked past the blue vase without slowing a single step, full of everything he had chosen, every single day, not to say. Lady Cecile Voss had noticed it first, the way perceptive women of a certain social standing always notice the things that the people involved are most carefully pretending not to feel. She had sat across from Maren at 3 separate dinner parties that season, and watched the Duchess of Ashbourne move through a room with the kind of grace most women spend years performing and never quite achieve, speaking warmly with guests, deflecting intrusive questions with a composure that never once faltered, laughing at precisely the right moments and not a moment beyond. And then she had watched Dorian Ashbourne stand not 10 feet from his own wife, without once turning in her direction, and thought, quietly, that something in that house was approaching an end. She was not alone in the observation. It had begun to circulate in the careful, lowered voice manner that society reserves for subjects too significant to ignore, but too delicate to raise directly. The Duchess of Ashbourne, it was noted, always arrived at events without her husband's arm and left without it, even when they had come in the same carriage. She never spoke of him with anything resembling intimacy, not the warmth of genuine affection, not the dry exasperation of a woman well accustomed to her husband's faults. She spoke of him the way one describes a building, with accurate, even respectful detail, and no personal feeling whatsoever. What none of them said aloud, though the thought moved through more than one drawing room that autumn, was that the woman they were observing was not diminished by any of it. She was, if anything, more distinctly herself than most women they knew, more direct, more present, more quietly certain of her own convictions. She simply wore the particular composure of someone who has accepted a grief in full, without drama, and chosen to build something livable inside of it. It was a kind of dignity that made several women in that circle feel, for reasons they struggled to name, quietly unsettled about their own contentment. There was a reason Dorian Ashbourne had built himself so carefully, though he would not have described it in those terms. He would have said he was a private man, a practical man, a man with considerable responsibilities and little patience for what he considered unnecessary sentiment. He would have said it with complete sincerity, because he believed it entirely, which was perhaps the most precise measure of how deep the original wound actually ran. His father had been a man of enormous warmth and equally enormous inconsistency, a duke who filled every room he entered and left a particular kind of emptiness in the spaces between his arrivals. Dorian had watched his mother wait beside windows more times than he could count. He had watched her arrange her entire life around an absence, organizing her days around the hours when her husband would return and briefly make the world feel full again. He had watched her make herself smaller, season by season, to fit a shape that was never quite the right size, and at some point in his boyhood, with the absolute quiet resolve of a child who has observed enough, he had decided, without drama, without ceremony, that he would never allow himself to need anyone, and he would never allow anyone to truly need him in return. He had kept that resolution with impressive thoroughness, what he had not foreseen, because he was, for all his considerable intelligence, a man who had long since stopped examining certain things, was that in constructing a life designed to prevent his father's particular damage, he had assembled a different kind of damage entirely, one that announced itself to no one, one that wore the face of discipline and self-possession and performed, at every public occasion, with flawless conviction, one that a woman with clear eyes and a small blue vase of flowers had been standing quietly beside for 3 years, offering him the one thing his carefully built life had no architecture to receive. Now you know why the doors were locked. You know about the boy who watched his mother arrange her entire life around a man who kept leaving. You know about the resolution made in silence. Never need anyone. Never be needed. You know how a wound, left long enough without examination, stops feeling like a wound and starts feeling like a personality. But knowing the reason is not the same as being spared the consequence, because Maren did not know any of this. She had stood outside those doors for 3 years, with nothing but patience and flowers, and the quiet, stubborn insistence on remaining herself. And she had received, in return, a polite and distant man who responded to her most honest confession by returning to his correspondence. For 3 years, she had kept every feeling exactly where it could not cause damage, beneath composure, beneath patience, beneath the daily ritual of flowers in a blue vase that no one ever noticed. But patience, even the deepest kind, has a final evening. What she does next is not an outburst. It is not a scene. It is the bravest, most heartbreaking thing in this entire story, and it takes less than 2 minutes. It happened on an ordinary evening in late September, with no witness but the firelight and the familiar sound of the house settling into itself around them. They were in the library after dinner, him at his desk, she on the window seat with a book she had not genuinely read for the better part of an hour. When she set it down, folded her hands in her lap with the care of a woman who has decided to say something true, and spoke his name. Not your grace, which was how she addressed him in company. His name, the 2 syllables she had used sparingly across 3 years of marriage, as though she had understood, instinctively, that using them too freely might cost her something she could not get back. He looked up from his correspondence with the expression of a man recalled from a great distance, present in form, the rest of him still somewhere far away. She told him, with the steady voice of a woman who had rehearsed nothing and was therefore saying only what was real, that she had been trying to reach him. Not as an accusation, not as a demand. Simply as a fact she thought deserved, after 3 years, to be spoken plainly between 2 people who shared a name and a house and very little else. She told him she was not unhappy in the way that required spectacle. She was unhappy in the quieter, more persistent way. The way that comes from sharing a room with someone every evening and feeling, without exception, entirely alone. He was silent for a long moment that she did not fill. Then he said something she had not anticipated. Not because it was cruel, but because it was so completely, honestly insufficient. He said he was sorry she felt that way. And he returned to his papers. She remained with that response for the length of 1 full, steady breath. Then she picked up her book, set it on the seat beside her with great composure, and walked to the door with the unhurried steps of someone who had just received the only answer she had needed, and had the presence of mind to recognize it as such. She did not cry. That was the detail she would remember most clearly afterward, that the moment she finally arrived at the decision, it had not felt like grief. It had felt like clarity. She sat at the small writing desk in her chamber with the candle burning low and the house entirely still around her, and she allowed herself, for the first time in 3 years, to think the thought she had been carefully navigating around like a stone in the center of a familiar road. The thought was simple. It was this: I cannot stay here and remain who I am. She did not think it with bitterness. She thought it with the same careful honesty she had brought to everything else in her marriage. The honesty that had always been her most sincere offering and his most consistently unreceived gift. She thought about the woman she had been before that Tuesday in October 3 years ago, the woman who had believed that patience and presence were a form of love that eventually answered itself. And she thought about who that woman was becoming, season by season, inside this house, inside this silence, inside a life arranged entirely around someone who would not meet her even a fraction of the way across a room, let alone a marriage. She wrote 2 letters that night. The first went to her aunt, whose small cottage in the north had always been the place in the world that felt most like genuine belonging. The second she left on her writing desk, sealed, addressed in her steadiest hand. She did not pack excessively, only what was truly hers, only what she had carried in with her. Before she left her chamber, She stood at the window for a moment and looked down at the garden below, the roses dark and quiet in the autumn night. The same ones she had cut from every morning for 3 years and brought inside like a small, faithful argument for beauty. Then she turned from the window, lifted her traveling case, and walked out without looking back. The blue vase in the east corridor still held its flowers. She had changed them that morning, as always, out of a habit that had become, in the end, entirely her own. He came down the east corridor at 7:30, as he always did. His boots struck the marble with the same familiar rhythm. His coat was immaculate. His expression was composed. The tall windows were pale with early light. The gilded mirror reflected him back exactly as it always had. Everything in Ashbourne Hall was, by every visible measure, precisely as it should be. He passed the first arch. He passed the window with the rose garden beyond it. He approached the second arch, the narrow table, the particular stretch of corridor he had walked 642 mornings in a row without once breaking his stride. He stopped. He could not have said in that first moment what exactly had arrested him. There was no sound, no movement, nothing dramatic to demand his attention. The corridor was exactly as it had always been, except that the table beside the second arch held only the blue vase, and the blue vase held nothing. No flowers, no pale roses, no winter jasmine, no careful sprig of something she had carried in from the garden, just the vase, empty in the thin morning light, with the faint ghost of water still at its base. He stood there for a moment that lasted considerably longer than a moment, looking at the empty vase with an expression no member of his staff had ever seen on his face before, because it was the expression of a man who has just noticed, for the first time, that something has always been there. He did not call for her immediately. That was not his manner, and 3 years of marriage had not altered it. He continued to his study, sat at his desk, and opened his correspondence with the mechanical precision of a man performing a task his hands remember when his mind is elsewhere entirely. He read the same paragraph 4 times. He set the letter down. He looked at the window. Outside, the rose garden was beginning to catch the morning light, the same pale gold he had walked past 1,000 times without pausing to observe it. Something in him was very quiet, in a way that was entirely different from his usual quiet. He went to her chamber an hour later. The door was open. The room was neat, too neat, the particular neatness of a space that has been deliberately set in order by someone who understood they were leaving it. Her writing desk was clear, except for a single sealed envelope addressed in her handwriting, his name on the front in letters that were steady and without flourish, which told him more about the state she had been in when she wrote it than anything the words inside could have done. He picked it up and held it for a long moment without opening it, standing in the center of a room that smelled faintly of lavender and morning air, listening to a silence that was entirely different in character from every silence he had ever cultivated. He opened the letter. It was not long. She was not a woman who used more words than a thing required, and she had not used more here. She told him she was well and would remain so. She told him she bore him no anger, and somehow that was the line that stayed with him longest, because it was so plainly, completely true. She told him she had tried, in the ways available to her, to build something real between them, and that she was leaving not in despair, but in the clear-eyed recognition that some doors open only from the inside, and she could not reach the handle from where she had been standing. She wished him well. She signed it with only her given name, the name he had not spoken aloud, he realized then, in longer than he could accurately recall. He read her letter. He stood in the center of her empty chamber, in a house that had not changed a single detail since she left, and he read the words of a woman who bore him no anger, asked for nothing, wished him well, and was gone. Most men in his position would have called it a misunderstanding, would have sent a formal message, managed the situation, restored the appearance of order, and moved forward as they always had. Dorian Ashbourne did none of those things. Instead, he walked his own house like a man reading a book for the first time that he had owned for years, and finding, on every page, evidence of someone he had never bothered to actually meet. What he is about to discover in the rooms of Ashbourne Hall will not be dramatic. It will be something far more difficult than drama. It will be the quiet, irrefutable proof of everything he chose, every single morning, not to see. And when that proof is complete, when the full weight of it has settled, there is only one thing left for a man like Dorian Ashbourne to do. The question is whether it will be enough, whether he will be enough, and whether the woman standing in a cottage garden in the north, the one who left him not in despair but in absolute clarity, will find any reason at all to let him try. He walked the house that afternoon in a way he had never walked it before, not with direction, not with purpose, but with the slow, unfamiliar movement of someone taking inventory of a place they suddenly cannot read. He had lived in Ashbourne Hall for the entirety of his adult life, and had believed, without ever consciously forming the thought, that he knew it completely. He understood now, with each room he entered, that what he had known was its surface. What he had not known was everything she had done to it. The arrangement of the sitting room had been quietly altered sometime in the second year of their marriage. The chairs repositioned to face the windows, the way the light moved across the floor in the afternoon, now unobstructed, warmer, more human. He had not noticed the change when it happened. He noticed its effect now, in her absence, the way one sometimes only recognizes music when it stops. The books in the library had been reorganized, not drastically, not in a way that announced itself, but with the careful logic of someone who actually read them, who understood which subjects belonged near which other subjects, and why. Small things, patient things, the accumulated evidence of a woman who had tended to a place that had never fully acknowledged her presence. He stopped in the doorway of the east corridor and looked at the blue vase for a long time. It occurred to him, standing there in the afternoon quiet, that he could not remember a single morning in 3 years when it had not held something. Roses, mostly, in the seasons when the garden gave them, other things in between, things he could not now name because he had never looked at them directly, only past them, only through them, only toward whatever was waiting for him at the end of the corridor that now, for the first time, he could not reach. He picked up the blue vase. It was lighter than he expected. He set it down again carefully, the way one handles something that has revealed itself, unexpectedly, to matter. It was his secretary, not Dorian himself, who first catalogued the practical dimensions of her absence. The household accounts were in perfect order, better order, in fact, than they had been under any previous management, with every expenditure annotated in her handwriting in margins so small and precise, they had the quality of a private language. The correspondence with the estate's charitable recipients had been maintained faithfully for 2.5 years, each letter written in her name, each response filed without any apparent expectation of recognition. The head gardener, when Dorian found himself in the unusual position of asking, mentioned with careful neutrality that Her Grace had spent considerable time in the rose garden each spring and had, over 3 seasons, quietly restored a full section of it that had been declining since before her arrival. None of this had appeared in conversation. None of it had been offered for his notice or approval. It had simply been done, consistently, invisibly, with the unhurried dedication of someone who believed that a thing worth doing was worth doing, regardless of whether anyone was watching. He stood in the estate office that evening, surrounded by evidence of a life he had entirely failed to observe, and felt something shift inside his chest with the slow, irreversible quality of a foundation settling. Not a dramatic collapse, but the kind of movement that announces, very quietly, that nothing will be quite level again. He found, tucked inside the back cover of the household ledger, a small dried sprig of lavender. He recognized it, or he recognized what it must be, now that he knew to look. The same variety she had tied into that last arrangement in the corridor. He held it between his fingers for a moment. This small, inconsequential thing, this fragment of a garden he had walked past 1,000 mornings and understood with the full, unshielded weight of it that he had been living beside someone he had never once made the effort to truly see. The lavender had no fragrance left. It had been pressed and dried too long. But it had been kept, and the keeping of it told him something about her that no conversation in 3 years of marriage had managed to convey, because he had never, not once, made sufficient room for the conversation to happen. Word traveled, as word in those circles always did, quickly, selectively, and with the particular energy of information that confirms what several people had already quietly suspected. The Duchess of Ashbourne had departed the estate. No public announcement had been made, no formal explanation offered, and the absence of explanation was itself the loudest possible statement to anyone fluent in the social language of that world. Within a fortnight, the drawing rooms had reached their verdict, and it was not, as Dorian might once have assumed, a verdict rendered against her. What surprised him, when fragments of it began to reach him, was the portrait that emerged. He had expected, in the dim and honest part of himself that was still capable of expectation, that the world's opinion of Maren would be roughly what his own had been, present, vaguely positive, and not particularly detailed. What he encountered instead was a woman described by people who had known her for a single season, with more clarity and more genuine affection than he had managed to accumulate in 3 years of living beneath the same roof. She was recalled as the woman who had remembered, without prompting, the name of a younger sister mentioned once in passing at a dinner table, as the person who had donated, anonymously, to the restoration of a parish school 2 counties over, as the guest who had stayed an extra quarter hour at a gathering, not out of obligation, but because she had noticed the hostess looked tired and had not wanted to leave her standing alone. It was Lady Cecile Voss who delivered this last account directly, not in a social call, not in conversation, but in a brief note that contained no advice and offered no judgment. Only the fact, plainly stated. She had been watching them both all season, and she had waited until now to say anything at all, because she understood that some things land differently when a man has finally earned the capacity to hear them. Dorian listened to these accounts with the expression of a man receiving news from a country he had always been told was unremarkable, and is only now beginning to understand was extraordinary. He had walked past her every morning for 3 years. He had sat across from her at dinner. He had shared a house, a name, a life in the purely administrative sense of the word. And somehow, in all of that proximity, he had managed to know her less well than women who had spoken with her 3 times over a cup of tea. He was not a man given to self-reproach, but that evening, alone in the library with the fire burning low and the house around him more silent than it had ever felt in all his years of deliberately cultivating silence, something in him sat with the full weight of what he had done, and did not look away from it. The weeks that followed were, from the outside, unremarkable. He fulfilled his obligations with the same precision as always. Correspondence answered, appointments kept, the estate managed with appropriate efficiency. Anyone observing him from a distance would have noted no visible change. He was, by every measurable standard, exactly as he had always been. That was the part he could not stop returning to. He was exactly as he had always been, and now, for the first time, he understood precisely what that had cost. Guilt, he had long since established, was a feeling that could be handled. It arrived, was acknowledged with suitable seriousness, and was then, with sufficient discipline, set aside for the next pressing concern. What moved through him in those weeks had no such method. It had no shelf. It did not respond to the tools he had spent a lifetime sharpening. It was the slow, irreversible recognition that what he had lost was not a social arrangement, or even a marriage in the formal sense. It was the only person who had ever looked at him, fully, without performance, without demand, and chosen day after day to remain anyway. And he had walked past her every single morning as though she were part of the architecture. He told no one where he was going. That, in itself, was a kind of declaration. Dorian Ashbourne had spent his entire adult life as a man whose movements were noted, anticipated, and arranged around. He had secretaries, a household staff of considerable size, a social calendar that functioned as a second form of governance. He had never, in his memory, simply left. He left now. He instructed the carriage north, gave no timeline for his return, and sat with the particular stillness of a man who has removed every familiar prop from around himself and is only now discovering what remains when they are gone. The journey took 2 days. He spent most of them looking out the window at a landscape that grew quieter and less performative the further north they traveled. Hills that did not announce themselves, villages without ambition, a sky that went on without any of the architectural interruptions that London required of it. He had brought nothing to read, which was unusual, and found that the absence of occupation forced him into a quality of thought he had been avoiding for longer than he was comfortable admitting. He thought about his father. He thought about the library at Ashbourne Hall and the way the chairs now faced the light. He thought about a woman who had left a sprig of dried lavender inside a household ledger and had not left it there for anyone to find. Had simply left it there because putting beautiful things in overlooked places was, for her, as natural and as unconsidered as breathing. He arrived at his aunt-in-law's cottage on the morning of the second day, when the light was still thin and the surrounding hills were the pale, unhurried gold of early autumn. The cottage was small in the way that certain rooms are small, not from lack of space, but from a considered preference for closeness, for warmth, for the kind of scale that makes a person feel located rather than diminished. There were flowers in the window box. He stood outside the gate for a moment longer than he had intended, this man of considerable title and no preparation whatsoever, and acknowledged to himself that he had absolutely no reliable method for what he was about to attempt. Then he opened the gate and walked forward, which was, it occurred to him, the first genuinely unrehearsed thing he had done in a very long time. She was in the garden when he arrived, kneeling in the soil beside a low hedge with her sleeves rolled and her hair not entirely disciplined, doing something practical with a pair of garden shears. She looked up when she heard the gate, and for a single unguarded moment, before either of them had said a word, he saw her, truly saw her, with the full and unobstructed attention he had withheld for 3 years, and understood, with a force that was almost physical, that she had changed, not in the way that people change when they have suffered, in the way that people change when they have finally, for the first time in a long while, been allowed to simply be themselves. She was calmer than he had ever known her. Not the controlled calm she had worn inside Ashbourne Hall, that careful, maintained composure that he now recognized, with some shame, as the particular poise of a woman working very hard not to let her unhappiness show. This was something different. This was ease. She rose from the garden with no hurry and no performance, brushed the soil from her hands with the same unbothered practicality he had watched her apply to everything, and looked at him across the small garden with an expression that was not cold and was not warm and was entirely, unmistakably her own. She did not fill the silence for him. She had, he understood, given up filling silences for other people. He had prepared, on the journey north, several versions of an opening, measured, composed, the sort of language he used when a situation required careful management. He looked at her standing in the thin morning light beside her aunt's garden hedge, in the cottage that was everything his house was not, wearing the expression of a woman who had not spent a single moment of the past weeks waiting for him to appear, and every prepared version left him completely. What remained was the truth, unedited, which was that he had come because the alternative was continuing to live inside a house that had shown him, in her absence, everything it had meant in her presence. He said her name, her real name, the two syllables he had rationed so carefully they had almost become a word he'd forgotten how to use. She looked at him steadily. She did not say anything yet, but she did not turn away. They sat in his aunt's small kitchen with tea. Neither of them was drinking, the light coming through a low window and the sound of the garden just outside. And he told her the truth. Not a version of it, not the diplomatically arranged summary he might have offered in a different setting to a different person. The truth about his father, about the years of watching what need could do to a person who attached it to someone unwilling to hold it steadily. About the decision he had made so young he had never once reviewed it. About the life he had built on that decision, which looked from the outside like self-possession, and was, from the inside, a very thorough form of loneliness that he had simply never had sufficient cause to examine until she left a room and took the only warmth in it with her. He did not present this as an explanation intended to resolve anything. He was careful about that, because he understood, in a way he had not understood before, that she had not left Ashbourne Hall in need of an explanation. She had left because she had offered him the truth plainly across a library, and he had returned to his correspondence. The least he could do in return was offer her the same honesty without expectation, not as a transaction, not as a strategy, but as the simple thing it was. A man admitting, for the first time in his life, that he had been wrong in ways that cost someone else considerably more than they cost him. She listened. She did not interrupt, did not soften the difficult parts for him, did not provide the small reassurances that social habit usually furnishes when a confession grows uncomfortable. She let him finish. Then she was quiet for a moment. Not the careful, managed quiet she had kept in his house, but the open quiet of someone who is actually thinking and finds it worthwhile to let the thinking show. When she spoke, she said that she believed him. She said it not as absolution, but as a statement of fact, because she had always been, above everything else, a woman who said what was true. She also said that believing him was not the same as returning, and that he should understand the difference before either of them spoke another word. She did not go back with him that day. She was not cruel about it, and she was not cold. She was simply a woman who had spent 3 years making herself available to someone who required no availability, and who had learned, in the month since she left, that her own time and her own peace were not things to be surrendered quickly a second time. She told him what she needed, not in ultimatum, but in plain language, the way she had always communicated when he had given her the space to do it. She needed to be seen, not praised, not managed, not positioned correctly at a dinner table. Seen in the ordinary, daily, unhurried way that costs a person nothing except the habit of paying attention. She told him that if he meant what he had said, then the proof of it would not be a declaration. It would be Tuesday mornings. It would be dinner conversation. It would be the accumulation, slow and unremarkable, of a man who had finally decided to be present. He returned to Ashbourne Hall alone. He wrote to her, not formal correspondence. Letters, actual letters, in his own hand, about the estate and the garden and the chair arrangement in the sitting room that he now understood she had changed 2 years ago, so that the afternoon light could come in unobstructed. He wrote about what he was learning to notice. He did not request her response or her return. He wrote the way she had left flowers, not as performance, but as evidence of a changed habit, as proof of a different kind of attention. She wrote back, not immediately and not at great length, but with the particular warmth of someone who is reading very carefully and finding what they read worth continuing. She came back in the spring, not because he had said the right things, and not because the old version of their life had been repaired. It had not, and neither of them pretended otherwise. She came back because she had watched, over the course of a winter, the slow and genuine effort of a man dismantling the walls he had built before she ever arrived. Not for social approval, not because the cost had become inconvenient, but because he had decided, at last, that she was worth the work of being truly known. On the first morning after her return, Dorian Ashbourne came down the east corridor at 7:30. He passed the tall windows and the gilded mirror, rounded the second arch, and stopped. The blue vase was back on its table. She had placed fresh roses in it before he woke, pale gold, the last of the early spring garden. He stood there for a long moment, not walking past. Then he turned and went to find her. When he did, he looked at her the way she had always deserved to be looked at, fully, without hurry, without the impulse to move on to the next thing, as though she were the only room in the house worth entering. She looked back at him with the clear, steady eyes of a woman who had known her own worth all along, had refused to surrender it, and had chosen to return not as a concession, but as a decision made freely, with both eyes open. Some things cannot be built quickly. The best ones never are. What they were beginning, slowly, honestly, without any guarantee but the daily choice to try, was not a restored version of what had come before. It was something new. And the blue vase on the narrow table in the east corridor, with its pale gold roses catching the first light of spring, was not a symbol of what had been lost and recovered. It was a reminder of what had always been true, that the people most worth knowing are often the ones we walk past without slowing, until the morning we finally stop. If Maren's story stayed with you, if her quiet dignity felt familiar, if his awakening arrived a moment too late and yet exactly in time, then you already understand why these stories matter. Subscribe to Dukedom Stories. New stories every week for everyone who has ever waited to be truly seen.